Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Clockedin with me, your host, Jordan Edwards. I'm thrilled to have you tune in as we dive into the dynamic world of productivity, success, and stories of incredible individuals who've mastered the art of getting things done. Whether you're commuting, hitting the gym, or just relaxing at home, this podcast is the go-to source for inspiration and actionable tips to level up your productivity game. I'm on a mission to unravel the secrets of those who seem to effortlessly manage their time and achieve their goals. So if you're ready to clock in and unlock your full potential, you're in the right place. We've got a lineup of amazing guests, industry experts, and thought leaders who will share their insights and strategies to help us crush your to-do list and make the most out of every moment. Get ready to get inspired, motivated, and equipped with the tools you need to supercharge your productivity. This is Clocked In with Jordan Edwards. Let's dive in. Hey, what's going on, guys? I got a special guest here today. We have Paul F. Austin. He's celebrated as one of the foremost voices in the field, particularly when it comes to working with high-level CEOs and industry leaders. Paul's the CEO of Third Wave, which shares a message about transformative power of safe and effective psychedelic experiences. Paul, how are you doing today?
Jordan, what is good, brother? It's good to see you again. I'm really glad that we had a chance to drop in last week and now share some goodness with your audience about microdosing and psychedelics.
Absolutely. I'm excited to talk about this one because it's something that we think too much about. We overthink it. People get concerned about it. They think it's going in the wrong place. So where did this journey for you all begin? Where did you get started just in life? And I know you have an interesting 20s and yeah.
Yeah. We talked about that a little bit. I was fortunate enough, and I've been fortunate enough to travel to between 70 and 80 countries over the last several years. But, I grew up in a pretty, I would say, traditional home in West Michigan, a suburb of a small city, and a close knit family environment. I attended church every Sunday for many years. Played the violin, was involved in sports, so really just had sort of a very sheltered and loving upbringing. I was very fortunate to have the parents that I had and the family unit that I had. At the same time, I was always rebellious, an independent thinker, did what I wanted to do. And so at the age of 16, my best friend told me about cannabis and marijuana. It was like, hey, I think we should try this. So we ended up smoking cannabis a few times. My parents found out about it soon after that. And we had a conversation one Sunday after church where my parents sat me down. And basically my dad looked at me and said, I can't believe that you would smoke marijuana. I haven't been this disappointed since my brother passed away in a car accident 25 years ago. And
Heavy.
as you can imagine, that hit me like a ton of
That's heavy.
bricks, right? Like super heavy. And it just goes to show the set and setting that my parents had been raised in the 80s, the war on drugs, just say no era. And they had been conditioned to believe that any drugs that are illegal must be really terrible. Right. And so fast forward a few years later with that same best friend, I did my first experience with psychedelics, which was psilocybin mushrooms. And that first experience and the experiences that came after that were profoundly transformative and insightful. And they set me down a path of choosing to live in an unconventional way throughout, my teens, my 20s, and into my early 30s. And as part of that path, I moved to Turkey, where I taught English for a year. And at that point in time, started to study quite a bit about becoming a digital nomad and working online. And soon after that, I moved to Thailand, where I launched my first business. And while building that first business, I heard about this thing called microdosing. And
Yeah.
microdosing is how you can take very small amounts of psychedelics to help with performance. And when I was 19, 20, 21, I was doing high doses of psychedelics, not crazy high, but definitely high enough to have visuals and have deep experiences. And I noticed that for a week or 2 weeks after those high dose experiences, I was more present, I was more connected, I made better decisions about the food that I ate, I meditated more often, and that after a few weeks, a lot of these really good behavioral things would start to sort of drift away. And so when I heard about microdosing, I thought maybe this is a way to keep that window of neuroplasticity open for even longer so I can continue to grow and develop as a human. And so I started to microdose in 2015 with LSD 2 times a week for about 6 months. It was great. And it was so great that I thought more people need to know about this. And so in 2015, I started the Third Wave as an educational platform about responsible psychedelic use. And
That's awesome.
over the last 8 years, I've been professionally involved in the psychedelic space, and our content has reached millions of people. I've done retreats we've done retreats for over 1,000 people with high doses of psilocybin. And then I've also had the great fortune of training over 200 coaches, practitioners, and clinicians in how to work with psychedelics from a both therapeutic, but more importantly, leadership perspective.
That's incredible. That's awesome. And it's interesting because coming from my upbringing, I was like, bad, like, don't do that. And I never really broke into that because I was always like, I don't even understand how this works. So this whole perspective for me is so unique that I'm kind of like the base person to learn from. I'm like, this is great. So for you, what was the eye-opening experience with travel? Like, where did travel come in, and how did it make you think about the world differently and kind of open your eyes into what was okay with drug use and what wasn't? And how did that all connect? Because I know many different countries have different areas and laws and what's allowed and what's not.
Yeah, I mean, like my parents, we were fortunate enough that growing up, it was myself, two sisters, and my mom and dad. So there were five of us in the family unit. And every summer, more or less, we would go on a trip.
Yeah.
So I was fortunate enough to go to Yellowstone when I was 10. We went to Alaska when I was 8. We went to the Pacific Northwest when I was 16. We went to Washington, D.C. when I was 14. And I was also fortunate enough to do a couple international trips. So when I was 11, I went to Costa Rica. When I was 17, I went to Romania. And then in college, I spent time in Ireland. I spent 6 weeks traveling around Europe. And then I spent a month in Tanzania.
Oh,
And
wow.
so in these early adolescent and college years, I was just exposed to like how beneficial and eye-opening travel can be. And, when I had these early psychedelic experiences when I was 19 and 20, a lot of the message insight download was don't spend your 20s trying to chase superficial things, trying to
Yeah.
make a bunch of money or trying to work a corporate job or trying to impress someone like, your family or your parents. Do something in your 20s that when you look back on it later on in life, you will be so happy that you went through that experience. And so I naturally then was really interested in how do I just travel as much as possible in my 20s as a way to expand my horizons, as a way to become more cultured, as a way to learn different languages, as a way to be adventurous and really push the boundaries of what I know is possible. And I would say psychedelics are one of the things that gave me that courage to do that, because when I was 21, I moved to Turkey and I lived abroad for 5 years, right? I lived in Turkey
Yeah.
for a year. I lived in Thailand for a year. I lived in Budapest. I traveled throughout, Europe. I lived in Lisbon, Oaxaca, and travel is just and has been one of my greatest teachers, because there's a way in which it requires presence. It requires curiosity. It requires being uncomfortable in many situations. And it requires an ability, I think, not to complain and to just accept whatever may happen. So when there are delays, when flights get canceled, when there are issues, when you pay way more for a taxi in Vietnam than you think is fair, right? You just sort of chalk it up to the experience of doing something unconventional, and what are the lessons that can be learned from that. And I think for me there's a lot of overlap there in terms of what psychedelics teach us as well, because especially in higher doses of psychedelics, we're often thrown into an uncertain landscape. we're
Yeah.
we're we're in a subjective experience that's totally unique, that in many cases we've never been subjected to before. And so learning how to be present with it, learning how to breathe through it, learning how to appreciate the experience of it is where so much of the benefits of psychedelics come from.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And I've never heard travel broken down in that regard where it connects to psychedelics and all of the skills you get. Because it's funny because I'm thinking about it through the lens of I like to travel, been to 25 different countries, and everything you said is absolutely true. But when you come back to your quote unquote home or regular, wherever you're living, you don't practice these skills of presence. You don't practice the skill of not complaining because everyone's complaining. But when
Right.
you're traveling, you don't even think about it. You're like, dude, yeah, I've already missed 4 flights. What am I gonna do? Like, it's outside of my control, and that's what we can do. But
Well, and
it,
I
yeah,
a way to think about this as well, just to fully land this. Aldous Huxley, who's a well-known writer, he wrote Brave New World and a number of other things. He would talk about how the greatest sort of incentive for us, or the greatest part of exploration now that we've explored the entire Earth and globe and all that, is exploring what he called the inner antipodes of the mind. And so there's a way in which psychedelics are helping us to better create the territory of what's going on in our subconscious and unconscious, what's going on in the brain and the mind. And it's almost like Carl Jung would talk about it as above, so below, right? So travel is the external, I would say, representation of being unconventional and exploring the unknown. Working with psychedelics is the internal. And they
wow.
both have, I think, a lot of parallel lessons to teach us.
And that's profound. And it's interesting because a lot of people are coming up on this travel idea because you can work remote, you can be a digital nomad, and it's all happening a lot more. And so, what was the thing? Because no one's really out there talking about psychedelics. So, like, were you concerned about when this was all happening and you kind of were entering this new space? Because it's even cannabis. Sometimes people are like, "Oh no, I can't talk about that." I could tell with your face right now. You're like, "It's fine. It's not a big deal." But were you concerned in the beginning? Like, did your
Well,
parents judge you? Like, did you think about that?
yeah. So I went through a few different phases, right? When I first started working with psychedelics, it was 2010. I was 19 years old, and I genuinely believed that these were illegal drugs because they were harmful, and
Yeah,
that I'm just a rebel, so I'm going to try them and work with them. And what I noticed, like I mentioned earlier, is that I experienced all these benefits, and yet I was still so brainwashed in a way, still so
of
conditioned,
course, of
that I
course.
thought, oh, I feel excellent and great, but I'm still, damaging my body or my brain in some way. And so I think the first thing to get through was like, actually, these are not detrimental or harmful. That LSD and psilocybin, if used with intention and responsibility, can be incredibly beneficial, because a lot of folks, including myself, we loop all illegal drugs into the same container, right? We think, oh, heroin, cocaine, LSD, psilocybin, right? When in fact, LSD and psilocybin are anti-addictive. In fact, clinical research has shown that they can help with addiction, alcoholism, smoking, opiate addiction as well. They're the safest drug that we have available to us, safer than alcohol, safer than tobacco, both of which are legal drugs. So LSD and psilocybin are safer than any other substance that we have available. And so a lot of these misconceptions, right, around the stigma that exists around psychedelics, I had to first confront myself and confront with my family. When I told my parents in about 2014, so 9 years ago now, that I've done LSD, I've done mushrooms, they were, you know, I remember my mom was like, "You're going to turn into a wet noodle," right? They could not believe it. They thought it was like the worst thing ever. And so I started to send them research and like, this is what is actually true. And eventually now, like just a few years ago, I actually did mushrooms with my dad.
Yeah.
So they become way more open to it.
And
Um,
I think that's so important that, like Paul is saying, this is just for the audience, and it doesn't even have to be in regard to any drug use or anything. Just changing your headspace can happen by traveling. Like going to a different area where you're not in that environment and changing the environment will change you as a person. And most of us don't understand that because we sit there and we think, oh no, I'd always think like this. Absolutely not. If you weren't born in America, you wouldn't think like this. If you were born in Thailand, you would think differently. If you were born in Israel, you would think different. Like people don't realize that the environment they're in changes the way, and the people around them and the things they're hearing change everything. So if you're not happy with your environment, definitely get up, maybe change it, go somewhere else.
and psychedelics can do that as well, right? Like definitely
Absolutely.
go to Europe, right? Or go to Asia, or go to Africa, right? Live and explore and be in a different culture and be there to learn the lessons. And also, like, another option is Take 5 grams of mushrooms, or start with a microdose. Start microdosing and see how that shifts your perception. Because once I experienced how beneficial these were, that's when I was like, okay, I really think a lot of other people are missing out. And now it's 2023. Psychedelics are very in vogue. Colorado has legalized psychedelics. Oregon has legalized mushrooms. The FDA is about to approve a lot of these. But back in 2015, when I started Third Wave, a lot of people thought it was crazy. And it's been a journey over the last 8, 9, 10 years. And we're now at a point in time where, Cal Berkeley just did a survey about a month ago. And it turns out that 65% of people in the United States support legal psychedelic assisted therapy. 65% of people.
Oh, wow.
There's also another interesting statistic that since 2019, so pre-COVID, since 2019, in the last 4 years, the number of people who have used psychedelics has quadrupled.
Wow.
4 times as many people use psychedelics in 2023 as in 2019. So clearly, more and more people are becoming interested in this. More and more people are recognizing the science and the benefits of it. And one thing I always emphasize on podcasts is it really comes down to responsible and intentional use. So even if your listeners are like, I might be interested in this, it really helps to have a coach, a therapist, a guide, someone who knows this and can support you. Because the truth is, while psychedelics have a lot of benefits, just like travel has a lot of benefits, there's a level of intensity with them, that I think a lot of people have never, they've never been in an experience that intense. And it can just really help to have someone who's there in your corner. It's like, the parallel for travel would be like you grew up in, a small suburb in the United States for 20 years, and then you get dropped into, the rainforest in the Amazon by yourself. And it's like, good luck. Right.
It's terrifying.
So I think, and taking a bunch of psychedelics can have a similar effect. Now it's much safer, and there's other things, but all that to say, a lot less stigma these days, a lot more people who are interested in this. And what I always tell people is start low, go slow, start with microdosing before you go into these higher doses, and do so with the support of a coach, therapist, a guide, someone who's there in your corner.
That makes a lot of sense, because I was sitting there and I was still like, your push, like it makes sense. Clarity, purpose, presence, these are all things that are missed. And a lot of society is missing it, especially with all of us going on our phones, doing all these different things. So it's, how do you get past that misconception, destigmatize this? Do you think that coaching could happen over a virtual session, or it would have to be with someone in person? I'm just curious, because it's an interesting dynamic here that's going on.
So there's a few different ways to think about the types of folks that can support you through a psychedelic experience. And we're starting to get into, I would say, slightly advanced territory, but I'll explain the basics of it so your audience can track and follow. So there's coaches, and coaches are people who are trained in coaching, right? A lot of coaching is focused on growth, development, inspiration, right? Creativity. It's how are we helping to create a new life for ourselves or dramatically improve our current life? That's what coaching can help a lot with. And so, as part of what we do at Third Wave, we actually train executive coaches, life and relationship coaches, health and wellness coaches, as well as some clinicians, in how to work with psychedelics. And what we emphasize is their role is to really help with what we call preparation and integration. How do you prepare someone to have a really great psychedelic experience, and how do you help them integrate after that psychedelic experience? They're not necessarily trained to guide someone through an actual experience. And so if someone is interested in being guided through an experience, it's important to find a guide or a therapist or a shaman who has a lot of experience bringing people into deeply altered states and ensuring that they have a very safe and effective experience. So all of that to say is some of this can be done virtually, right? Like the coaching element can be done virtually, the preparation and the integration, but having someone who is physically present with you as you're going through this experience, especially if it's a high dose, it is so critically important to have even if it's just a friend or family member, someone you trust, someone who can help you go to the bathroom, someone who can be there to hold your hand, someone who can be there to help you get a glass of water, who can keep you safe, right? Having just a trip sitter is what we call them, who is present with you, is better than just doing it alone. But the ultimate is to have a guide who is trained and experienced, because the output is going to be that much greater if you have someone who's very skilled at navigating those spaces. Um, so yeah, it can be a mix of virtual and in person. But again, for if someone is going to do this, and it's important that they have someone physically present with them so they feel very safe doing it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so what do you think are some of the biggest misconceptions that people are having about the drugs in general? I mean, is it just our society, our societal norms? Is it just like what do you think's really going on with all of this?
Well, the name third wave of psychedelics, it suggests that there have been two previous waves, right? The first wave and the second wave of psychedelics. And so the first wave of psychedelics was the indigenous and ancient use of these plant medicines for thousands of years. So what a lot of folks don't realize is that we as a human species have actually been working with psychedelics for thousands and thousands of years. And some of the most influential philosophers, thinkers, leaders worked with psychedelics. So people like Plato, Aristotle, Marcus Aurelius, right? They were all involved in what were called the Eleusinian mysteries, which happened in ancient Greece, where they worked with something called koukion, which is a beverage made from ergot, a fungus that grows on red, a psychedelic beverage that they drink. So a lot of folks don't realize that we have a rich historical context from a Western lineage where a lot of the most influential philosophers actually worked with psychedelics. And then, the Christian church became the official religion of the Roman Empire. These Eleusinian mysteries were shut down in the 4th century. And as a result of that, a lot of this psychedelic work went, totally disappeared. And it didn't really come back until the 50s and 60s, the counterculture, when LSD was invented. And over 1,000 clinical papers were published on the efficacy of LSD for a range of things, from like depression to addiction to anxiety to autism. Right. So what a lot of folks don't realize is we have so much clinical data on the safety of psychedelics, on the efficacy of psychedelics, right? Back from the 50s and 60s. But even currently in this third wave of psychedelics, there have been hundreds, if not thousands, of clinical papers published now about the efficacy of these medicines. And I think that's the other thing to recognize and realize, is that these aren't like these other illegal drugs. These aren't like heroin or cocaine. These are incredibly safe. And when used with intention and responsibility, have been clinically shown to have significant benefits. And some of those benefits include, an alleviation of depression, healing PTSD, curing alcoholism. A lot of the benefits also relate to creativity, better communication and relationships, better strategic vision as a leader. So we have documented clinical results that show that psychedelics are incredibly effective tools. And I think a lot of people don't recognize or realize that. They just loop these legal drugs in with everything else. And I think the final misconception to address is these are already legal in the United States. Not everywhere, but as I mentioned before, Colorado has legalized a lot of the psychedelics. Oregon has legalized psilocybin. California, the Legislative Assembly passed a bill to legalize, but the governor just this past weekend vetoed it, unfortunately. So there's a lot of progress. And in fact, by next year, the FDA is expected to approve MDMA, which is also commonly known as ecstasy or Molly. The FDA is expected to approve MDMA to treat PTSD. So starting next year, people will be able to get a prescription for MDMA if they have PTSD in order to treat their PTSD. So this is huge, right? The historical relevance and context, the fact that these are anti-addictive, these aren't like other illegal drugs, and the fact that these are already legal in many places means that, my estimation is that by the end of this decade, so by 2030, the vast majority of people in the United States will have legal access to psychedelic substances.
Wow. So why do you think it's been held off for so long? Because it sounds like there's been a lot of positive things that have occurred from it. And it's interesting. I mean, obviously there's a lot of not to get too into it, but what do you think's kind of holding it back? Obviously, it's
Well,
progressing forward, but things, yeah.
like, yeah, what took so long? So, like, why have these been illegal then for 50 years? So, when Richard Nixon really started the war on drugs in the 60s, what he made clear is that these drugs were not made illegal because they're harmful necessarily. These drugs were made illegal because the anti-government protesters were using them in the 60s.
Oh,
And
wow.
so, I mean, just to make a long story short, hippies who were also protesting the Vietnam War were using cannabis and LSD. And because you can't make being a hippie illegal, you can't make protesting illegal, they had to make the drugs that these people were using illegal. And so they made LSD and cannabis illegal so that that way they could essentially arrest these Vietnam War protesters who were against the war. So it was much more politically focused than scientifically focused. But I think going beyond that, right? When people have a high dose psychedelic experience, there is a way in which they come to some interesting realizations, and they have some really interesting insights and downloads. And one of the core ones is they have this direct connection that opens up to source, God, nature, the mystery of existence. There's something that happens that a lot of people call a mystical experience when
Okay.
working with high doses of psychedelics. And the reason psychedelics haven't been used in more mainstream religions is because mainstream religions are dependent on a power structure that has a priest or an imam or a rabbi. And that priest, imam, or rabbi, they are the ones that have the connection to God, and you have to go through them in order to cultivate that relationship. Well, when you take a psychedelic, you come to realize that no, I myself can open up this direct relationship to something beyond. Right. And so historically, for thousands of years, psychedelics have often been used by people who are rebellious, who are independent, who don't want to necessarily follow the conventional ways of thinking. And so the challenge, of course, is, if you have a bunch of people waking up through psychedelic use, how do you continue to control them and manipulate them? Utilizing pharmaceuticals, utilizing shitty food, utilizing all these things. So I think part of the reason they continue to be illegal in the modern age is because when we work with psychedelics, we come to realize that the system that we exist within is incredibly sick, and that we have to make a choice and a decision to actually step outside of that system, to no longer engage in materialism and consumerism, to no longer engage in destroying the planet around us, no longer engage in a lot of these what I would consider to be really detrimental and harmful behaviors. And so that is quite threatening to the general status quo. And so I think that's why they've continued to be suppressed and illegal. I think another reason, just to kind of build off of this, is, if you look at how pharmaceutical companies make their money, a lot of it is by convincing people that they need to take a pill every day for the rest of their lives. SSRIs, benzodiazepines, antipsychotics, ADHD medications, right? And pharmaceutical companies give children as young as 4 or 5 these drugs that they then become addicted to and hooked on, and they can never get off of. So they're creating lifetime clients. And what psychedelics do is when you work with a psychedelic, it actually gets to the root cause of the challenge and struggle that you're facing. And so instead of having to take a pill every day for the rest of your life, you can actually heal a lot of that trauma, meaning you no longer have to take a pharmaceutical drug every day. And so that is also quite, I think, it's challenging to the status quo, because a lot of pharmaceutical companies are realizing that as psychedelics become more and more mainstream, that they're actually going to help to address this mental health crisis. And so a lot of these folks are no longer going to basically want to be dependent on pharmaceutical companies to feel good, more or less.
Absolutely. I mean, that is profound. It's interesting. And I'm curious if your original mission at 1920, that initial trip that you went on, did that impact all of those thoughts? Because I was sitting there and you're naming all of these things that are occurring when you go through and you realize you're like, well, this I don't really like. This doesn't make sense. This doesn't make sense. The food, the this, the that. And I'm sitting there and I'm like, it felt intense for me just listening, because I'm like, this took me years to accumulate these ideas, let alone them happening to you in, I don't even know how long the trips last or any of that, but in that short duration of time where you're like, wow, I've learned a lot. Because this whole download thing is pretty interesting to me.
Well, I probably worked with high doses of LSD and mushrooms 15 to 20 times, and I was 19 and 20. So those years, it was like it was
Learning.
emerging, unraveling, right? It wasn't just like, I definitely had some really powerful experiences, but it was definitely over that period of time, over those couple of years where I was coming to realize this. And a lot of it came down to the sense of sovereignty, autonomy, and choice, right? That when I worked with psychedelics, I came to realize that I am a sovereign being. I am fundamentally the creator of my own existence. I have full responsibility for everything that happens to me. And recognizing and realize that the system, the culture, the structure that I was born into is not meant to be supportive and nourishing of me becoming sovereign, autonomous, and a creator. In fact, the system and structure that we're born
The
into
opposite.
is mostly there to do the opposite, to make us consumerists, to make us feel like we need to consume to feel good, to make us, eat shitty food and take pharmaceutical medications and be obese and watch TV and all the bullshit. Right. So it's like I woke up from that, from the matrix, for lack of a better
Yeah.
term, through psychedelics. And then my entire life has been, okay, I've now gone on that path. I've helped others to come in that path. And I'm really motivated by then how do we create a new paradigm of living that transforms education, that transforms business, that transforms healthcare, that transforms all of these things to be much more rooted in this sort of truth of interconnectedness. Because a lot of our current systems are rooted in separation, they're rooted in extraction, they're rooted in, I think, inequality, they're rooted in sickness and poison. And I think we really are at this sort of, we're in this sort of meta crisis, right? Where it's a crisis of meaning, it's a crisis of the ecological, it's a crisis of mental health, it's a crisis of work. And I think a lot of what can help us to create a new paradigm to address this meta crisis is the responsible use of psychedelics by the leaders, creators, and builders of tomorrow. And so that's, I know we talked a lot about the mental health on this episode so far, but that has really been my professional focus and emphasis, is how can psychedelics help the leaders, builders, and creators of tomorrow wake up and actually develop new systems that are much more representative of regeneration, reciprocity, relationship with the land, great relationship with food and the environment. These are things that I'm really motivated and driven by. And they do go back to those early psychedelic experiences. Because when I was taking a bunch of acid and going in the woods, what would come up for me is it's so sad how we treat our environment. It's so beautiful. Nature is so beautiful. And I really just felt compelled to be a steward of the land and of the environment, because it really is what nourishes us and keeps us healthy. And the more disconnected we
You
get
get
from the land, I think less healthy we are as a society and an organism.
100%. And it's really interesting because I remember we were talking previous to this episode and in the previous one that you talked about working with high level executives, working with CEOs, working with founders. And just in that role, there's so much stress and there's so much anxiety and there's so many people that you would never expect people to be like, no, I'm actually stepping away a little bit. Like, elaborate on that, because this part blew me away when you were explaining it earlier.
Well, so over the last, let's say, 100 years, right, when we've lived in this structure of industrialism, the things that have been most valuable is how much work you can get done, how productive you can be, right? How many car parts you can put on the assembly line, how many words you can write. And with artificial intelligence, with automation, with more and more of these technologies that are beginning to emerge in 2023 in this decade, we as humans are going to have to do less and less stuff, right? A lot of the things that require convergent thinking, which is get this done, get this done, get this done, get this done, that's going to be handled by artificial intelligence and automation, right? It's going to handle a lot of the sort of logistical tasks that we need to get done. And so what that means is a lot of people's time and energy is going to be freed up. And what is increasingly true, and this is particularly true in like the tech world and Silicon Valley and sort of like cutting edge founders and entrepreneurs, the greatest competitive advantage is creativity and innovative thinking. In other words, divergent thinking. How can you integrate two ideas that are seemingly have no relation and bring them into a synthesis of connection to form a new idea and a new way of being? And so when you're looking at the leaders and builders of tomorrow, they have to think on their toes. They have to be adaptable. They have to be resilient. They have to be creative. And I think most importantly, they have to pick a mission or a vision that aligns with a deep purpose for the people that they're choosing to create with. In other words, business as usual is often we are incentivized by money. This company is going to pay me a lot more, so I'm going to go work for them. Oh, this company just offered me more. Okay, I'm going to go work for them. But what happens in a world where we have a universal basic income? What happens in a world where all of our fundamental things are taken care of? When we no longer need to earn a lot of money to feel like we are fulfilled, to feel like we live a meaningful existence. Well, we are going to want to choose to pursue activities that we find to be beneficial, that we think help other people, that we think are meaningful and maybe help the environment, whatever it is. So leaders really need to focus on missions and visions and building organizations and companies that incentivize people based on impact, based on meaning, based on fulfillment, rather than just how much money they're going to bring home at the end of the day. And I think psychedelics can really help with that, because when we work, especially leaders, builders, and creators of tomorrow, when they work with psychedelics, especially at high doses, they come to realize that all of these ego-driven things of, these external markers of success, how much money I make, how many women do I sleep with, what's my, how famous can I get? All of these sort of superficial ego markers, when we work with psychedelics, they tend to just fall away. We come to realize those are actually not that important to leading a meaningful and fulfilling existence. Well, what is? A relationship with our family, a relationship with ourselves, a relationship with our community, helping others, doing meaningful work, right? Creating, being in flow. And so what I've noticed is as more and more leaders and builders have worked with psychedelics, they have dramatic, not only, are they way less stressed, making better decisions, their mental health is better, they're not nearly as burned out, but even more importantly, they're starting to pursue missions that have a triple bottom line. Certainly, they still need to make money, right? We still live in the structure and system. It's important to make money, but they're also looking at, how does this impact my community, right? How does this impact, the city or the town or the organization that I'm part of? And then also, how does this impact the environment? And what are ways that I can use business as a force for good, as a way to regenerate the earth for the generations to come? And this is why I love Elon Musk and his vision. Is he's really focused on how can we be good ancestors? And so that's what I always root in with business and with psychedelics and leadership. It's like, how can we be good ancestors? How can we leave the earth in better shape than we found it? So that way, 3 generations from now or 7 generations from now, the people who are still around are in gratitude to those who came before, which is not the current situation that we live in. The current situation that we live in is, how the fuck did we get in this mess? And a lot of the people who put us in this mess are now dead. And they were building businesses and organizations and doing things to serve them, to serve me. Yeah. And I think we really need to start looking at, how do we look at business as a force for the we, as a force for the us, as a force for making the world a better place fundamentally to live in.
Yeah, I think that's incredible. And the biggest distinction I got was the time that we think about. Like, what's the time frame we think about? Like, I was talking to someone today and they're like, dude, I'm broke. I need money today. And they're going to think about something one way. You, on the other hand, are sitting here like, hey, I've been doing third wave since 2015. Right. Cannabis is not, psychedelics have not been the it thing for 8 years. Like you are not hopping on a wave. Like you are much before the wave, building the foundation, going longer term with this because it's a bigger mission. And it's not just, hey, let's make this happen. Like I'm trying to make money today. It's like, no, no, no. I'm trying to change the way people think about business and the way people think about different ideas. And I think that's so powerful because there's so much of us that don't focus on that. And we're always like the amount of times that when I was starting this podcast, like I'm 148 episodes in or something, and people in
Wow.
the beginning were like, why are you doing the podcast? Like, how much money you make? And what are you doing? And I'm like, I don't think you realize the relationships you make, the conversations you have, and then the fact that we have this conversation and I get to share it and people get to listen to it. It's the fulfillment is going 100 different ways because there's good models that win. There's models that win, and it's sharing those models and people seeing those models. And it's an Elon Musk, someone who's at the top echelon going, I think we should all be able to speak our own way. Okay.
That as well. I
Democratic
like
social
that.
platform. Yeah.
I like that about Twitter and X, right? And I love the way that you contextualize that, because I look at it as like, so oftentimes, especially CEOs, entrepreneurs, people who are go-getters, we are conditioned to believe in hockey stick growth. We are
Yeah.
conditioned to believe, it's like I need to raise $100 million in VC money and I need to grow at, 1,000% year over year. But if you look at nature, the only thing that grows that fast in nature is cancer. So I think we forget that the more that we can create a reality that mimics nature, the healthy parts of nature, the healthier we are going to be as entrepreneurs, the healthier we are going to be as business founders. So instead of 7 years, I say 7 generations. Right? How do you build and start a company or a mission where you're like, what will this do 7 generations from now, which is about 200 years, right?
Yeah.
Where is this? So that's how I think about third wave. I'm like, for me, I don't think our mission will be accomplished in my lifetime unless, longevity medicine really takes off and I live till I'm 300 years old, which could happen. I would not be surprised if it happened. But I don't think it's going to be something that is fully accomplished in my lifetime, because our vision is cultural integration of psychedelic substances so that it dramatically changes the paradigm that we live in. And sure, we've made incredible strides the last 5, 6, 7 years, but the truth is the vast majority of people on a global level are still ignorant and uneducated and have no skill set whatsoever when it comes to psychedelics. And so this is why I love microdosing, just to land a lot of this. I wrote a book called Mastering Microdosing that folks can find on Amazon. I love microdosing because my hypothesis and my assumption is that not everyone is going to want to take 5 grams of mushrooms or go drink ayahuasca or do a really intense psychedelic experience. A lot of people just want to take a microdose, a sub-perceptual dose of a psychedelic 2 or 3 times a week for a period of maybe 30 to 60 to 90 days. Because they see benefits, they notice they're more present, they're less reactive, they notice they have a better mood, they have more energy, but they don't necessarily have to have this really, really, really intense experience. And so I would love for nothing more than if 1 generation from now, instead of everyone taking SSRIs, they're all taking microdoses of psilocybin, right? Or instead of everyone taking ADHD medication, they're all taking a different type of psychedelic microdose that's much healthier. And I would love 5 generations from now, right? My vision is that we all live in communities. We all live in somewhat intentional communities in relationship with the land, in relationship with each other. So we get outside of these sort of suburban, isolated environments. I think so many people struggle because of just the structure that we find ourselves in, and that we actually have to dream up a new paradigm of living for people to really feel like healthy and nourished on a sustainable basis.
Yeah, I love that because so I have Edwards Consulting where we coach people and it's mental health, physical health, community service, philanthropy, spirituality, and relationships. And the amount of people who have relationships who are so lonely because they don't have deep relationships, it's astonishing because I sit there and I go, it's not the deep relationships. It's because they think of a friend as someone to grab a beer with. I'm like, that's not a friend. A friend is someone who's going to have a deep conversation with you. A friend's going to be celebrating you. A friend's going to talk to you on a deep level, not go, yo, how was fantasy football today? Like, it's like, fine, like that's the topic. But like, if we could talk about deeper things that connect us in a way that just can transcend, and we feel good about ourselves after leaving the conversation. Or maybe we're like, oh, I got to work on myself. I got to be better. That's the type of relationships. And that's why I was seeing more of these like compound livings where you have like 10 houses, you have the family, the kids, the extended, because everyone's so isolated nowadays. They don't realize that they need some sort of community to come together. And that's why I think online is kind of good, because it is connecting people in certain ways.
It's a good start. I don't think it's not the
100%.
sort of
Yeah, it's not the end piece. No,
the
not
end
at all.
goal necessarily. And I'm glad you mentioned this, because a lot of it is how are we living like we had lived for thousands of years before the modern industrial period, right? We always lived in community. We always lived with lots of sunlight. We always lived, our feet on the ground. We ate a certain type of diet, right? We didn't eat all this processed food. So I think part of this as well is this, what I call the sort of retrieval of the primordial way, right? How do we reactivate this sort of wild side of us biologically in particular, and create external structures that really mimic how we lived as thousands and tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of years before we were stuck in suburbs, with cars, not moving at all, with shitty artificial light, and, putting bullshit in our body. There's a new paradigm, and that new paradigm is actually rooted in ancient practices. And that's what I think psychedelics, in many ways, wake people up to: the remembrance of, oh, I actually just need to simplify. I need to do less rather than more. And by doing less rather than more, everything else in my life will feel much better.
Wow. That's profound. That is incredible. Oh, now we're winding to the end. So, Paul, tell us, where can people find you? Where can they hear about Third Wave? Where can they learn more? And if there's any last comments you want to leave, for sure, share them.
So for folks who are listening to this, who maybe have never done a psychedelic or are very new to this, I would say just go to thethirdwave.co. That's our homepage. We have a newsletter. We have a community that you can join for free, where you can start to meet others who are also interested in this space. We have a podcast as well called the Psychedelic Podcast. And then if there are any coaches or practitioners or therapists or any folks who want to do more professional work in this space, or interested in working with psychedelics as a tool, we have a training program for coaches and practitioners, and that's at the Psychedelic Coaching Institute. And that's very simply psychedeliccoaching.institute, to find out more information about that program. So thethirdwave.co, psychedeliccoaching.institute. It would be great, Jordan, if you have show notes and you could.
Yeah, I'm going to drop everything in the show notes.
But I think those would be two great places to start for folks based on where they're at in their journey.
Awesome. Yeah, I'll drop everything in the show notes. Paul, you have been awesome. You're changing my perspective. It's super interesting to hear this. So I can't wait to get this out here. And I really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much, Jordan, for creating this platform and for your willingness to have a conversation about psychedelics. They're still edgy, but I do think the more we can normalize them and help people understand how they can be used intentionally and responsibly, the more people will benefit from utilizing them.
Thank you for reaching the end of the podcast. For that, we'll give you a complimentary coaching session in the link below with Edwards Consulting. Hope to see you there, and have a great day, and keep clocking in.